What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the worst parts of my favorite games, or at least a few of them, as I have done a video like this roughly a year or so ago, and given that I've reviewed so many games since then, and have made some new favorites even, I thought it might be fun to talk about them in this context, because, while, as the title should have told you, I really do enjoy and love all of these games for different reasons, all of them are united by the fact that they have at least one part that I really don't enjoy. And given that I review games, it's pretty natural for me to go, I enjoyed everything about this game except this one part, for instance, which is what I think makes videos like this pretty fun for me, at the very least. But with no further ado, let's dive into it. And right out of the gate, we have The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion and its level scaling. If you watched my relatively recent retrospective on this one, I did a very deep dive on the level scaling in particular because of how very broken it is, especially when you combine it with the progression systems inherent to the game as well. But the level scaling of Oblivion is notoriously bad, even though Oblivion is a game near and dear to me, and it is full of many janky systems well beyond just the level scaling, but that is the part of it that I don't find endearing at all, really. Now, luckily, because it's a Bethesda game, there are tons of mods that tackle this exact issue, so if you don't want to deal with it, you don't have to, and it's probably one of the rare cases where I would just flat out recommend dealing with a mod instead of dealing with the actual system. And this is because of the way the level scaling works in particular. Though it is something they ironed out later in Skyrim, Oblivion's level scaling comes with the problem that enemy health infinitely scales with your player level. And while damage numbers will eventually plateau out, enemy health does not, which in the late game, if you haven't done anything to prevent it, enemies turn into gigantic damage sponges, or at least the leveled enemies specifically do, and you'll run into various forms of a goblin that can have potentially thousands of health and takes forever to kill. And having played through that game recently, I can honestly say that while I have many fond memories of that title, that is certainly not one of them. Which does bring me to my second entry, however, which is the escape from Rykard in Rogue Trader. A relatively recent release, Rogue Trader put us in the role of a rogue trader in Warhammer 40k's first proper CRPG. And while that was, for the most part, an experience I greatly enjoyed, even though it was a little buggy on launch, I especially loved going through the game in my first playthrough fully dogmatic, meeting out the God Emperor of Mankind's righteous fury. However, over the course of playing Rogue Trader, both in its alpha, beta, pre-release, later the actual release, many times over, one part in particular never was particularly fun, and that was escaping from Rykard at the end of the prologue area, or Act 1, if you will. And specifically, what I don't like about it is that after you've done this part of the game a few times, it just becomes a giant slog. There are several very large battles against cultists, which are very numerous, with roughly a dozen of them per fight. And they all do essentially the same thing. And these fights take a little while because they're in turn-based, and it just feels like you're fighting the same fight several times in a row. And while that section of the game does end in a very cool boss fight against a Chaos Space Marine, I really never enjoyed going through that section of the game in the many times I played it, outside of the first when I didn't even know what to expect. And while Act 3 of the game, Kimura, definitely had some unpleasantness for me, this section really does take the cake. Third up, however, we then have Baldur's Gate 3. Now, I played through Baldur's Gate 3 about a dozen times. I think it was literally a dozen, actually. And that is a lot of times to play through a game, and one section of that game got incredibly tedious for as big and reactive as that title is. And for me at least, it was always the slog through the Gauntlet of Shar and the subsequent dungeons up to the end of Act 2. Again though, towards the end of Act 2 and the actual boss fight and everything at that section of the game is really, really cool, but the act of getting there, and once you're several playthroughs deep, got really old really fast. Now, the Gauntlet of Shar is a series of trials that you have to pass to gain access to the night song, as it were. And while I won't spoil any of that, try to leave the big reveals for different videos, I suppose, but I will say that once you've been through that area a couple of times, you kind of know what to do, and it doesn't really change that much playthrough to playthrough, because while there are a few people to interact with and have a discussion with, and you can approach those characters and solve their problems in different ways, the thing is, the end of Act 2 is where the game kind of starts coming to a point in order to catapult you into the actual city of Baldur's Gate, which means they need to start pulling the narrative threads together, and as a result, the Gauntlet of Shar and the subsequent areas are a bit less reactive than everything that preceded it, which meant, for the most part, it was just a big dungeon slog. And while that's not so bad, the first time through, when you're still learning the enemy placements, what to do where, etc., once you hit like playthrough 4 or 5, you've got all that sorted out and you're just trying to burn your way through it, and there's not a whole lot going on narratively that you don't already know about and likely haven't already seen at that point, which as a result tended to make me go through the Gauntlet of Shar on autopilot after a while, and it's definitely the part of that game where I have the least amount of fun. Though that does bring us to number 4 on the list, with Jagged Alliance 3. A very interesting title where we play a band of mercenaries doing mercenary work for the island of Grand Chien, which is undergoing all sorts of problems, everything from a spreading plague, government coups, and more localized problems. Over the course of Jagged Alliance 3, though, on its world map, you're going to be setting up outposts as you take them over from the enemy, training up militias to guard them and everything, so you can make your way to the other side of the map and try to rescue the country's president. After you do this, however, there is a big reveal that I won't spoil, but the consequence of which is enemy teams flooding the map and taking out all of your outposts if you're unprepared. Now, if you are incredibly prepared and you know it's coming, you can sort of set up a proper defense for this and push it back a little bit, though you likely still will not be able to hold everything. And from a gameplay standpoint, I honestly kind of hated this, because after you reach that particular reveal of the story, there's not that much game left, really. You're going to be rounding a few things up, gathering some evidence before you head to the end game. And realistically, all this sort of sweeping of your outposts and likely your ability to make money is slow you down and add to the playtime a little bit, when I think really the game should have been more focused on reaching its narrative conclusion based on the many choices you've likely made up to that point. And because of that, every single time that kind of thing happened, for me at least, it was a very deflating feeling. So as much as I enjoyed Jagged Alliance 3, easily my least favorite part. Which does bring us to our final entry, a game I haven't talked about too much here lately, though I have mentioned it, which is Expeditions Rome, my favorite game from 2022, an alternative history about the life of Julius Caesar, where instead of Julius Caesar being there, it's you taking on his role as your own character. And it's a ton of fun, but I believe I've actually mentioned this in my review for that title. There was one part I wasn't terribly fond of because of how it was handled, and these were the siege battles that were usually at the end of each act. These were multi-part attacks on strongholds of the enemy of some sort that would see you leading multiple teams of your individual characters across turn-based battles with, of course, certain objectives, like securing the battlefield in some way, and usually you had access to siege equipment like catapults and the like. But this ran into a few problems. One, these battles were massive, which means the turns could take a while, and as a result, the entire siege could last several hours of game time, which had some problems compounded with the fact that the siege weaponry was highly inaccurate due to, I would say, the enemy AI just knowing where it was going to land, as it would mark a portion of the map, and then all of the enemies would immediately move out of that on the next turn before the impact could actually occur, which meant taking out large groups of enemies with those siege weaponry the game gives you is more difficult than I thought it really should be. And when you combine those things, you get those siege battles at the end of each act, which were a bit underwhelming, though narratively, I think once you got to the end of those battles and saw the end scene, I think it was usually worth it. But I really never did enjoy those as an overall concept. It was just a lot of setup and planning. You might not even have enough characters to fill out all the teams properly, which means certain sections of it might be really rough. And it's definitely where the game had the most potential to go wrong, in my opinion, which is obviously what it's doing on a list like this. Though I do believe that pretty much wraps up everything I had to talk about in this particular video, which has been some of my least favorite parts in my favorite games. Because as always, I think constructive criticism is important. Nothing is perfect after all. And with that exact thing in mind, I would love to hear about either just your straight up favorite parts of various video games, as that's always fun, or what parts of the games you really love you didn't quite enjoy so much. Which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.